Frank said that what you said is untrue and it's lies. Bob Arum's assured him there's been no conversations between the two of you. Thoughts and reply to that?
Thoughts is my nose has just gone and wrapped around the Manchester Arena 7 times. What do you think? Do you think that... I mean, I've had about half a dozen conversations with Bob Arum since the Fury Wilder fight. We've talked about the deal, we've talked about the TV companies, we've talked about the split, we've talked about the date, we've talked about the site, and these are all wrapped in with the Kubrat Pulev. What does Frank think that I'm going to speak to Bob Arum all these times and not talk about Fury Joshua? It's the biggest fight in the world. So it's not my fault that Bob hasn't told Frank that they haven't been discussing. On our side, it's very straightforward. Just talk to me and we'll get it done. I don't know, he says he's in charge, he says he's in charge, he says he's in charge. But of course I've spoke to Bob Arum 6 or 7 times. We've discussed virtually everything. We've talked about step-aside money, we've talked about the Pulev fight, we've talked about when the fight would happen, we've talked about how it would work on ESPN and DAZN, we've talked about BT, we've talked about Sky. It's not illegal. You know what I mean?
So I think Frank...
So keep, does it, by the way, we're more than happy to sit around a table with Frank Warren and Bob Arum and MTK and everybody. I'm just telling you, Bob Arum's calling me non-stop. I'm calling him about stuff. And we're talking about Crawford, Brook, Joshua, Pulev, Fury. This is what we do when you communicate. Unfortunately, I've never had a conversation with Frank Warren. But I'm more than happy to. He can call me up if he wants. We'll sit around a table. And we may end up sitting around a table all together. But it doesn't stop me having a conversation with Bob Arum about the biggest fight in world boxing when he's Tyson Fury's promoter. So I don't know why he wants to call me a liar for saying I've spoke to Bob Arum, but I've not only spoke to Bob Arum, I've spoke to Bob Arum about basically every issue around the deal. There's been no numbers, there's been nothing discussed. We're talking about how the deal works, when it can happen, and where it can happen. And all those conversations have been extremely positive.
Cheers, Eddie.
What's those conversations been like in terms of like where it would take place and whatnot?
Nothing. All the conversations have been, what do you think about the rematch? Do you think we could look at step aside? Yes. And then obviously he exercised his rematch clause. Then we talked about where it would be, when they would like to do it. We talked about the TV, how it would work with ESPN and DAZN. We talked about BT and Sky, all these, but minor stuff. You know, we're not negotiating the deal. We're just talking. You know, we're talking about the big. In fact, if Team Fury and Team Joshua had not had a conversation since that fight, fans should be very, very concerned. You know, it was 2 weeks ago. It's the biggest fight in boxing. Everyone wants to get it made, so of course there's going to be conversations. Conversations, not negotiations. That's the difference.
There's a topic that's been raised, obviously, with that fight, the Fury-Wilder fight, and so much has been said already about Fury's glove conspiracy and all that behind it. Do you believe any of that, or it could even be...
Not really. I mean, look, I've seen the slow-mo and everything. It don't quite look right, but, you know, people have got to understand. It's a bit like when people said to me, Anthony Joshua had a panic attack. You've got to understand, when you box in America, you have an inspector from the commission that does not leave your side. You know, those gloves would be inspected prior, when he's got the wraps, when the wraps are in the glove. You know, it's very difficult to slip a glove down, and I don't see what benefit you can get from not having your fist inserted in a glove properly, unless you want to cup someone around the side, which weren't really happening. So it looks like bollocks to me, but over to you.
Callum Smith was obviously here tonight. He spoke to Sky and he said that Canelo's team only made one offer and then they didn't reply. With looking like Billy Joe is going to face Canelo, where does Callum go from here?
I think it's frustrating for him. You know, the person that wasn't going to get the fight is always going to be frustrated. I don't think there's still a chance he could get, like, it's small, but you never know. You know, we've gone back to Golden Boy on a contract. We're ready to go. We talk about press conferences next week. If all of a sudden something fell through, he would get the fight. But right now it looks like Callum's not going to get the fight. We have to look at the likes of Danny Jacobs. We have to look at the likes of Caleb Plant. You know, Benavidez is tied up. Chris Eubank Jr. Maybe a John Ryder rematch. And, you know, he has to do what he does, keep winning. But, of course, he does want the biggest fights possible.
Finally, one more from me. Kell Brook and Crawford, you mentioned there. They obviously met in Vegas, had a little chat. What's the situation there? You mentioned it, obviously.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Bob Arum about that fight, and we talked about, the Saudi fight with Pacquiao, Mikey Garcia, or how does Crawford fit into that mix? Then we talked about Crawford fighting Kell Brook, which is a fight we like, and, you know, that's something that we're open to as well.
Cool.
Amir can't face that mix at all.
Not really, no. I mean, I think Amir's
Fight fans, it's Michelle Joy Phelps. If you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube channel, make sure you go ahead and do so by clicking the icon right here and also hit the bell button so that you can get alerts every time we upload a new video.